Total disclaimer, I'm not a mechanic in any sense of the word, and as much as I enjoy building things, I really don't like working on cars, and I only do it out of necessity. That said, here's the deal. When I had a Honda, it cost about $20 with a coupon to have the dealer change the oil. Fast forward a couple of years, and Volvo wants about $100 to do the same thing, so DIY Aaron comes out of the woodwork, although very reluctantly. Total cost for this oil change, excluding tool purchases, is about $35 to $40. That's based on $25 to $30 for 6 quarts of fully synthetic 5W30 oil and an aftermarket manned filter, roughly $10 on Amazon. It's also worth mentioning that today we'll be working on a 2014 S60 two-wheel drive with the T5 engine. Now before we get started, I'll say that as far as European cars go, Volvo oil changes are actually pretty easy, but you will need a couple of specialty tools that you might not have lying around the shop. First, you'll want to pick up a 10-inch extension for 3/8 inch drive sockets. You'll also need a 17mm socket, a 36mm socket, a T30 driver, and finally a 3/8 inch universal joint. That last piece isn't totally necessary, but it will save you a ton of headache later on, so I think it's worth spending the $10 on. Furthermore, they do come in handy in a lot of other scenarios, especially around cars. In order to access the drain plug, we first need to remove the brush guard or skid plate or whatever it's called. It needs to be out of the way. This is where your T30 driver comes into play. If your car is anything like mine, it should have 8 screws total, though thanks to the sloppiness at the local dealer where it's always been serviced in the past, it was down to 6. Apparently they're not super critical. Next up is the removal of the oil drain plug. This is where the 17mm socket comes into play. If you're wondering why there is currently oil dripping out of it, it's because I broke the plug loose off camera. If yours looks this way before you've taken a socket to it, that's a problem beyond the scope of this video. After loosening the plug, I like to get the oil drain pan right underneath the drain hole, though sometimes I always misjudge how far the oil will run out at first and end up coating my garage floor. Unlike most American cars, the oil filter is accessed from the top of the engine bay, not from beneath. It's just to the left of center, and as you can see from this photo, it's a little awkward to get to without the 10-inch extension and the universal joint. Also worth noting, and I don't know if this is just my dealer or what, but they really seem to over-torque the crap out of this cap. So much so that I had to use a breaker bar off camera to get it loose. Hopefully you don't have this problem. It's always something new and challenging with cars. After breaking the cap loose, I proceeded to remove. It's simply a matter of unscrewing and lifting out the cap and filter assembly. From there, the old oil filter just snaps out. After removing the old filter and cleaning up a bit, it's time to start putting things back together. Also, don't forget to remove the old O-ring. Your new filter should have come with a replacement. If not, that's kinda on you for buying a no-name one off the internet. I like man filters. In fact, I've seen some OEM Volvo filters with this brand name on them, so I think they're legit. So put a little clean oil on the new O-ring and slip that over the thread or the cap threads and back into its little groove. And then finally slide the filter back on. Make sure you feel it click into place. If you don't feel it click, you're not in far enough. Then simply screw the entire assembly back into place. Now, after it's hand tight, I'm going to use my socket extension, universal joint, and 36mm socket to tighten it up. I know the 100% correct way to do this would be to use a torque wrench, but I don't have one and I've never had a problem doing it without. Because it's a little hard to see from this angle, here's a close-up of what the socket assembly looks like. You know, again, just picture trying to get in there without it, you'd drive yourself mad. After the filter assembly is reinstalled, I went ahead and screwed back in the oil drain plug and reinstalled the brush guard. I didn't bother to get a shot of it because I assume that if you're good enough with a wrench to get it off, you should have no problem getting it back on. Also worth noting is that you should always replace the crush washer. I've changed oil and not changed the crush washer without issue, but they're so cheap, I figure why take the risk. After everything is back together, let's refill the engine oil. Volvo recommends 5W30, and because this is a turbocharged engine, fully synthetic is mandatory. I find no real difference between the major name brands, so I typically buy whatever's cheapest. In this case, I'm using Mobil 1, because Amazon had a Prime-only deal, $26 for a 6-quart case. The owner's manual calls for 5.8 quarts, so that was the perfect amount. Though in practice, I'll actually add about 5 quarts, then start taking dipstick readings to dial in the exact amount. For what it's worth, don't buy an oil drain pan from Walmart, or at least don't buy a cheap one. Despite getting most of the oil in the pan, it still managed to leak out from the very poorly sealed cap. Instead of spending $10, it really would have been worth it to spend $20. Now before we get into the final and by far most frustrating step, I just wanted to take a minute and ask anyone watching to hit that subscribe button. Finally, links for all consumables and tools used to make this video are in the description. By purchasing from them, your support of this channel is greatly appreciated. With that, let's take a look at resetting the service indicator. Unfortunately, Volvo makes resetting the service indicator more of a chore than it needs to be. Not that it's difficult, just somehow frustrating. Before we get going, let's take 1 second to talk about the ignition states. This might sound like fluff, but it's worth knowing because it's important to the process. When you first get into the car without pressing the start button, you're in ignition state 0. This means that some interior lights or electronics work, but the car hasn't really turned on yet. Ignition state 2 exists when you press the start button. This turns on almost all interior electronics and allows the windows to work. Ignition state 3 means the car is running. In other words, you've long pressed start and with your foot on the brake. For the purpose of this video, we want to start in ignition state 2. So get in the car, close the door, and quick press the start button. I have no idea why, but this doesn't seem to work unless the door is closed. Next, using the rotary dial on the left lever, navigate to T2 or trip 2. Finally, press and hold the OK button on the end of the left lever. Still holding the OK button, press and hold the start button, but do not put your foot on the brake. If done correctly, the information light will start to blink, about 10 seconds. At this point, release both buttons. It's very important you release the buttons while the info light is blinking. If you've done everything correctly, you'll hear a chime indicating the service interval has been reset, and congratulations, you now have 12 months or 10,000 miles to worry about this.